General Hospital spoilers tease that the story of Drew's attempted assassination sent shockwaves through every corner of Port Charles, igniting a firestorm of suspicion, betrayal, and psychological warfare that no one was truly prepared for. In what should have been a quiet evening, Drew was ambushed just blocks from the Metro Court, struck down not in a back alley far from the public eye, but in a calculated move within the very heart of the city's bustling pulse. It was bold, audacious, and intentional. The knife wound tore through flesh, but it was the chilling precision of the attack that left the deepest scar, both on his body and his psyche. Drew didn't fall. Bleeding and staggering, he fought off the masked assailant with brute instinct and years of survival training, narrowly escaping what should have been a fatal blow. But surviving wasn't the end of the story, it was just the beginning of a far darker chapter. This wasn't just a warning, it was a declaration of war. And in that moment, everything began to unravel. As news spread through Port Charles, the impact was immediate and relentless. The police launched a full investigation, but every suspect had a motive, and every motive came with a history soaked in betrayal. Drew's relationships had always been complex, tenuous alliances, broken loyalties, unresolved grudges. And now, all of it was coming back to haunt him with deadly consequence. Michael, already on edge from his own spiraling drama, was forced to question how far his involvement with Drew had pushed others toward desperation. Willow, shaken by recent events and her own fragile grasp on normalcy, found herself doubting everything and everyone, even herself. Carly, furious and protective, demanded answers, but her own history with Drew was enough to raise questions about where her loyalty truly stood. Sunny, calculating and composed on the surface, knew immediately that this attack had roots deeper than anyone realized. He recognized the signs. This wasn't a crime of passion, it was strategic, organized, surgical. Someone wanted Drew eliminated with ruthless efficiency. Someone with power, resources, and no intention of stopping. Behind the scenes, whispers began to swirl about possible culprits. Was it Nina, whose vendettas ran deep beneath her polished exterior? Was it Christina, whose growing instability had already raised eyebrows? Was it even someone like Curtis, caught in a web of deals and secrets that could be unraveling faster than he could contain them? But as the list of suspects grew, so did the paranoia. Drew became a ghost in his own life, avoiding hospitals, refusing security, trusting no one. He spiraled into obsession, retracing his steps, analyzing every word from every conversation in the weeks leading up to the attack. Nothing felt safe. Every phone call, every knock at the door, every unfamiliar face in a crowd became a trigger. And yet beneath that chaos burned a single driving force, revenge. The truth was, Drew had made enemies. Too many. His manipulations, his secrets, and his constant interference in the lives of others had finally caught up with him. He had stepped on the wrong toes, crossed the wrong lines, and now someone was coming for what they believed was justice. But Drew wasn't going to wait for the next attempt. No, he was going to take control. He began building a list, not of suspects, but of targets. People who had reason to want him gone. People who had motive, access, and hatred buried just deep enough to pretend civility. He began to tail them, watching them from the shadows, collecting whispers and half-truths, waiting for someone to slip. But the deeper he dug, the more terrifying the picture became. This wasn't just one person. It was a network, a tangled web of silent agreements and unspoken rage. And Drew was the center of it. Meanwhile, the emotional impact of the attack rippled across the city. Those who once considered Drew an ally began to reconsider. Those who had held back their contempt now saw an opportunity. The knife wound was healing, but the wound to Drew standing in Port Charles was still wide open. Some questioned whether Drew had staged the attack himself to gain sympathy or throw off suspicion from something darker he was planning. Others believed he knew exactly who tried to kill him, but was protecting them for reasons no one could yet understand. And in the midst of all this speculation, another layer of horror emerged. Evidence surfaced that this wasn't the first attempt. There had been smaller threats, strange accidents, near misses. Drew had ignored them. Brushed them off. But now, as he connected the dots, it became painfully clear. Someone had been stalking him for weeks. Maybe months. Waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And they had nearly succeeded. With tensions at an all-time high, trust completely shattered, and enemies multiplying in the shadows, Drew found himself not only trying to stay alive, but trying to outmaneuver a threat that refused to show its face. The city was no longer his. Every familiar hallway echoed with danger. Every friend could be a traitor. The only thing he knew for certain was that the next time they came for him, they wouldn't miss. Unless he found them first. The war for Drew's life had begun, and it was dragging the entire city into its darkness. No one would come out of this untouched. And Port Charles would never be the same again. The shadows surrounding the attempt on Drew's life began to thicken with every passing hour, but in the corners of his fractured mind, two names rose to the surface like venom breaking through a wound: Alexis and Curtis. What once had been alliances, partnerships forged through shared secrets and complex trust, had now turned into twisted suspicions and unresolved betrayals. Drew, no longer the calm strategist but a man ruled by survival instinct and paranoia, began to believe that the people closest to him were the ones who most wanted him gone. His gaze, sharp and relentless, now fixated on Alexis and Curtis with a quiet fury that bordered on obsession. Curtis had always walked a thin line between law and compromise, shadowed by deals, personal battles, and allegiances that shifted like sand beneath the tides. His proximity to too many secrets, his silence when Drew needed clarity, and his growing detachment from old loyalties all made him look less like a friend and more like a liability. Drew couldn't shake the memory of curt conversations, missed calls, the look in Curtis's eyes the last time they met, something unreadable, cold, distant. Could Curtis have turned on him? Could a man fighting for control over his own life and body be desperate enough to eliminate the one person who might expose a deeper truth? And then there was Alexis. Brilliant, calculated, and capable of masking pain with stoic logic, Alexis had carried her own demons for far too long. But Drew had started to see the cracks, conversations that felt rehearsed, subtle deflections when he spoke about safety, and the way her gaze lingered on him just a moment too long, not with warmth, but as if calculating risk. Drew remembered how she had once tampered with evidence for people she loved, how she had lost herself in the pursuit of truth, even if it meant dancing with the darkness. Could she have been the one holding the blade that night, or worse, could she have been the one who gave the order? The adjustment in Drew's perspective was drastic, even dangerous. This wasn't the Drew Kane who tried to rebuild. This was a version sharpened by trauma, haunted by betrayal, and obsessed with justice at any cost. He started tailing Curtis late at night, watching his movements, noting every meeting, every whispered conversation, every unexpected detour. He hacked into Alexis's digital records, emails, calendar entries, convinced that somewhere in the web of her legal maneuvers lay the motive, the connection to the person who wanted him dead. This wasn't just paranoia anymore. It was an all-consuming obsession. The attack had rewired Drew completely. He wasn't seeking truth. He was hunting ghosts, ghosts that wore the faces of people he once trusted, people who had shared his pain, his plans, his past. And with every sleepless night, every whispered theory scribbled into the pages of his private notebooks, he grew further from the man he once was and deeper into a persona that saw danger in every shadow. Others in Port Charles began to notice. Carly tried to reach out but was met with cold distance. Michael offered protection, but Drew rejected it with a thin smile that hinted he no longer trusted anyone, not even those who once called him family. The more they tried to help, the more Drew pulled away, convinced that every kind word masked a hidden blade. He began constructing a private war room in the basement of an abandoned Quartermain property, walls plastered with photos, maps, red string tying together timelines and faces. At the center of it all, Curtis and Alexis. Their names circled in black ink, their files thick with every moment of doubt and betrayal he could recall. And yet, there was something deeper, an ache that Drew couldn't admit to himself. What if he was wrong? What if this descent into suspicion was the real enemy? What if he was becoming the very thing he swore to fight, paranoid, broken, and consumed by vengeance? But that voice of reason was drowned by the pounding echo of fear. Fear that if he didn't act now, whoever had tried to kill him would finish the job. Fear that if he hesitated, the next blade wouldn't miss. Fear that the people he once loved had turned into monsters behind smiling masks. It was one of the most dangerous emotional shifts Port Charles had seen in years. Drew wasn't just reacting. He was spiraling. And the terrifying part? He believed he was doing the right thing. That isolating himself, that tracking his friends, that weaponizing trust into suspicion was the only path forward. Because someone tried to kill him. And if he couldn't prove who did it, if he couldn't protect himself from those who claimed to care, then he would tear down every last person until the truth came bleeding out. This wasn't just a storyline about a man healing from trauma. It had become a warpath paved with obsession, mistrust, and a terrifying certainty that the enemies were no longer outside the walls. They were sitting across from him at dinner tables, offering smiles laced with venom. And until the truth was uncovered, Drew wouldn't stop. Not until Curtis was exposed, not until Alexis was interrogated, not until the ghost of the blade that nearly killed him was given a name, a face, and finally, justice. Drew had once been a man of resolve, a figure who moved with quiet strength and unwavering purpose, but after the attempt on his life, something shifted within him so profoundly that even those closest to him began to notice the change. He was no longer driven by survival or reason but by a slow-burning fire of obsession that consumed him with each passing hour. The trauma of nearly being killed hadn't humbled him, it had awakened something much darker, something relentless and calculating. And as the days wore on, that fire began to morph into a chilling form of clarity, one that no longer sought justice but retribution. He began to see enemies everywhere, but none more clearly than Alexis and Curtis, two people who had once stood by his side, now reimagined as architects of his downfall. In Drew's mind, it wasn't just paranoia, it was revelation. He replayed every past encounter, every hushed word, every unexplained glance between them, convinced that beneath their smiles lay secrets, and behind their concern lurked betrayal. Alexis, with her ability to manipulate the law, and Curtis, with his entanglements in both the underworld and the respectable elite, had the means and motive. And Drew was no longer content with questions. He wanted answers, and if he couldn't get them through conversation, he'd find them in confrontation. The lines between friend and foe had completely dissolved in Drew's reality. He stopped answering calls. He avoided familiar faces. He spent hours digging through old case files, surveillance footage, public records, anything that could tie Alexis or Curtis to the failed attack. And as the evidence remained elusive, Drew didn't retreat into doubt. He escalated. To him, the lack of proof was further proof. They were too careful, too experienced, too smart to leave a trail, which meant he had to become smarter, colder, and more unpredictable. He began tracking their routines, showing up at their usual places, not saying much, just watching, analyzing, waiting for a slip. His silence spoke louder than accusations. The tension in Port Charles began to shift. People started whispering about Drew's behavior, how he had grown distant, intense, and dangerously focused. But no one dared approach him. Not yet. When Drew finally made his move, it wasn't with anger, it was with icy control. He cornered Alexis late at night outside her office, his tone calm but loaded with implications. He didn't accuse her outright, but the questions he asked made it clear he no longer saw her as an ally. Curtis wasn't spared either. Drew confronted him in the gym, unannounced and unwelcome, speaking in riddles, drawing lines Curtis never expected to be crossed. What was once a foundation of trust between them cracked open beneath the weight of Drew's suspicions. The conversations were brief, cryptic, and unsettling. Neither Alexis nor Curtis could understand what triggered such a drastic shift in Drew, but they both knew something dangerous had taken root inside him. And then came the escalation. Drew started gathering weapons, not metaphorical ones, but real, tangible instruments of war. He justified it as protection, but those close enough to notice the gleam in his eyes knew better. Drew wasn't preparing to defend himself. He was preparing to strike. He was ready to eliminate anyone he believed had betrayed him, and at the top of that list were Alexis and Curtis. Port Charles hadn't seen a transformation like this before, one of its most stoic figures slowly turning into someone capable of anything. And with no checks left on his behavior, Drew began setting traps, psychological, emotional, and perhaps even physical. His home became a fortress. His schedule, erratic. His presence, menacing. Alexis, sensing the threat, tried to appeal to the man she once knew. She reached out in private, attempted to talk him down, but Drew met her words with silence and a look that chilled her to the core. Curtis, never one to back away from confrontation, stood his ground when Drew approached him again, this time with veiled threats laced in calm tones. What should have been a tense conversation turned into an unofficial declaration of war. The fragile peace between the three collapsed entirely. Soon after, strange things began to happen. Alexis received anonymous messages warning her to be careful. Curtis's security system was tampered with. Drew, when questioned, denied everything with a smirk that said more than words ever could. It became clear that this wasn't just a man unraveling. This was a man becoming something else entirely. A version of Drew that wasn't bound by morality or trust, only by a mission to expose and punish those he believed had tried to end his life. What made the situation even more volatile was that neither Alexis nor Curtis could be certain Drew was wrong. They knew enough about each other's secrets and alliances to fear that there might be more to the story than either of them had admitted, even to themselves. That ambiguity, that haunting uncertainty, became the foundation of the psychological warfare Drew was now waging. He didn't need to strike first. He only needed to make them believe he might, and that belief began to erode their confidence, their composure, and their ability to predict his next move. The air in Port Charles grew heavier by the day, thick with dread and anticipation. Rumors swirled. People began to distance themselves. Even those who had once stood by Drew now questioned whether they truly knew the man at all. And Drew, he thrived in it. The fear, the confusion, the silence, it all worked in his favor. He had become the storm no one saw coming. The once reliable protector had now become the unpredictable force of vengeance stalking the shadows of his former life. And in his mind, he wasn't the villain. He was the last man standing in a world of liars, and if he had to burn every bridge in Port Charles to uncover the truth, so be it. Because to Drew, justice no longer meant peace, it meant reckoning. And he was just getting started. Drew is no longer the man who once operated from a place of measured calculation and trust. He has become something far more volatile. With every shadow that passes and every whisper in the corridors of Port Charles, Drew has grown more convinced that there is a plot unfolding behind his back. His mind, once focused and precise, is now burdened by obsession, consumed by the fear that everyone around him is hiding something, planning something, plotting something that will once again place him in danger, or worse, bury him for good. That one failed assassination attempt was all it took to turn Drew's world upside down. Now, he sees conspiracies in every conversation, betrayal in every sideways glance. His instincts, once sharp from years of tactical experience, have twisted into something darker, paranoia mixed with dangerous resolve. He is alert to every detail, every shift in tone from those around him. He has become an expert in silence, in decoding what's not said more than what is. His vigilance has transformed into obsession, and the lines between reality and suspicion blur more with each passing day. Every action from Alexis, every comment from Curtis, every hesitant word from even his oldest allies now registers as confirmation of his fears. And in Drew's unraveling mind, confirmation demands action. The more he watches, the more convinced he becomes that he is surrounded not by friends but by enemies cloaked in familiarity. That belief, untested and unchecked, feeds a growing rage within him, a fire so intense that it scorches any remaining capacity for trust or reason. He's begun making plans, extreme ones. Not just to protect himself, but to strike first, to hit before he can be hit again. To destroy before he is destroyed. His every move now is calculated toward domination and survival. He's stockpiling information, studying every security system in town, tracking patterns and compiling dossiers on the very people who once called him a friend. He's no longer interested in exposing lies. He wants to make them pay. Drew believes that if the people of Port Charles want war, then he will give them one they won't forget. And worse, he believes he is justified. That belief makes him dangerous. Untouchable. A man with nothing left to lose and everything to avenge. The obsessive energy has taken root so deeply that it consumes his every waking moment. He hardly sleeps. He barely eats. His eyes scan rooms like a man on a battlefield. Every word spoken to him is weighed, dissected, and filed away in his growing mental war room. He has become the architect of a coming disaster, one that he believes is not only necessary but righteous. And while others still dismiss his behavior as post-trauma tension, they have no idea how close he is to taking irreversible steps. Drew's presence has shifted the atmosphere in Port Charles. People feel it before they even see him. There's a crackling tension when he walks into a room, as though something explosive is just under the surface. And the most terrifying part is that Drew is no longer trying to hide it. He wants them to feel it.